Hey folks, just as people continue to come on here, I'm just going to tell you that this event is being recorded and will be available for streaming at a later date. Derry City and Londonderry Council and Donegal County Council and Artichoke Arts Festival will share the link so you can pass it on to people that didn't get a chance to come along today. Okay, I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction here. So on behalf of Derry City and Strabane District Council and Donegal County Council, welcome to the next Northwest Cultural Exchange event at Artichoke Arts Festival, the future of events with Helen Marriage. Helen Marriage is the co-founder of Artichoke, a company that over the last 15 years has transformed people and places across the globe. Artichoke works with artists to invade our public spaces and produce extraordinary and ambitious events that live in the memory forever, transforming people's lives by changing the way they see the world. Artichoke don't believe that the arts should take place only behind the closed doors of theatres, concert halls or galleries. Instead, Artichoke work in the street, public squares, along the coast or in the countryside. The company's aim is to work with artists to create unique, large-scale experiences that appeal to the widest possible audience. I had the pleasure of meeting Helen Marriage for the first time in 2011 while working as part of the programming team at Culture Company 2013, which was the company led on the delivery of the Derry's Year City of Culture. One of the key events that year was the closing event, which was Lumiere, an event that is still talked about to this day, not only in the city but across the country. The event saw a series of light installations created by local and international artists that reimagined the public spaces across the city, reminding audiences of the past, but which also sought to bring them together. Who can forget the magic of the fire garden at St. Colum's Park, or the projection mapping of Austin's and the Everton Clock Tower, or Christophe's Fredisco ambulance, which projected the testimony of city residents and their experiences of the Troubles onto buildings, including Free Derry Corner and the Guildhall. Or Tim Mitchell's artwork on the roof of Rosemount Shirt Factory, A Stitch in Time, which honoured the city's industrial heritage when it was the shirt-making capital of the world. This artwork remains in place today, and it's an artwork that the residents of Rosemount and ordinary people from across the city took to their hearts and successfully campaigned last year to reverse a decision taken by local politicians to dismantle the piece due to the relatively small cost of its maintenance. I also think that the Teenage Kicks neon, created by Deepa Man Clear, currently remains homeless somewhere in storage in the city, just waiting for a roof of a building to shine on again. So if anybody's got a large roof spare, feel free to contact us and we'll see if we can put it up. I do think that Helen's experience of working in Derry at this time gave her a chance to get under the skin of Derry, to appreciate and understand its history and develop a genuine affection for this place, and also to develop real and lasting relationships and friendships with groups, organisations and individuals across the city. It was an even greater honour for me to work alongside Helen and the Artichoke team again in 2015 when she invited the artist David Best to Derry to work with 40 local unemployed volunteers to build a 72-foot high wooden structure in Scale. For those who don't know, Scale is on a hill overlooking the city. The project flipped the North's divisive bonfire tradition on its head and used fire as a way of enabling the local community to come together, to let go of the past and look to the future. Up to 60,000 people visited over the 7 days it was open, covering the inside of the structure and its central pillar with personal messages. And on the 7th night, the structure was ceremonially set alight with 15,000 people watching it burn as the hopes and dreams of thousands drifted into the sky. Most recently, Helen was Director of Galway 2020 European Capital of Culture, one of the many cultural events that has fallen victim to the current health crisis. Today, Helen will share her thoughts on what the future events might look like for audiences, artists, and industry providers. As health and emergency initiatives are seen as an immediate priority, how can the arts and cultural community ensure the shift from growth to survival mode is not prolonged, creating irreversible damage? How can we continue to dream big ideas when the world and resources are seemingly contracting? Helen's going to speak now. There's an option there on your screen, Q&A, if you'd like to put some questions in there, and following Helen's presentation, I'll ask her some questions. Enjoy.
Hello. Very nice. I know you're all out there, but it's hard. We don't see you. So this feels a bit odd, a bit like talking to myself, although I have got the lovely Gareth to talk to. I'm going to talk for about half an hour. If you've got questions, do type them into the Q&A and Gareth will moderate them, and we'll try and get through as many questions as possible. I just wanted to start by saying how flattered I am to be invited to do this talk, given that I have no crystal ball, no ability to know what the future of events might be like, just to know that there will be a future, and that people like ourselves and other companies who work in the way that we do might be able to play quite a significant part in getting us all back up and running again. It's probably helpful to look at what it won't be like, and I thought I just did a few little pictures so that I can talk about what we've done in the past and things that I think might not be possible in the near future. So I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me while I just do a quick flip through this presentation. So if anyone can't see that, then shout, probably in the questions, and I'll adjust it. But I hope you can see a screen that says "The Future of Events," which is, I think, the title of this this webinar. So Artichoke was created in 2006 for the presentation of a single show. We never really imagined we'd do anything more than that. The company was a vehicle to deliver to London the work of the extraordinary French company Royal Deluxe, who are real incredible exponents of creating large-scale events that use the city as a backdrop or a theatre. So no compromises in terms of what they do. As a producer, you simply have to clear the streets for them in order that they can play in those public spaces. And that's a very complicated thing to do. It was our baptism of fire, really. This is not going to work. Hold on 2 secs while I just get this screen to work. So this is the show they made. I don't know if anybody saw it, but The Sultan's Elephant was a life-changing moment in certainly London's theatrical history. It took me 7 years to negotiate the permissions to make the authorities that run London understand that it was possible that the ceremonial streets, as they're called, which are normally used for military parades, political arrivals of, presidents of state from all over the world, or for demonstrations, or for celebrations of rare English sporting triumphs, Rugby World Cup, cricket, that kind of thing, football, never, that those streets could also be used as theatre. And what you see here in this photograph is the Sultan's Elephant, a creation by Royal Deluxe, which was a fairy tale told on a large scale to the people of London, visitors and residents alike. The story was very simple. A sultan had been had news that a little girl was skyrocketing through the world in space and time, and he wanted to visit her. So he invented his own time traveling machine in the form of a giant wooden elephant, and with his entourage of concubines and eunuchs and elephant drivers arrived in town unannounced as the little girl crash landed her rocket into the town. They spent 3 days together. On the final day, the fourth day, the little girl decides to leave. The elephant is weeping. Everybody in the crowd is weeping. She gets back into her rocket. She takes off in a big pyrotechnic explosion and disappears. In our case, the pyrotechnic explosion happened 100 feet from number 10 Downing Street, and 9 months only after the 7/7 bombings that had devastated the transport system of London. I'm sure you can all imagine what negotiating the permissions was like, but more interesting, and in terms of what we're doing now, this was the audience for that event. This is the closing day. The BBC reported 1 million people on the streets. We didn't count because we were a bit busy. And what you see there is all kinds of interesting things happening. Obviously, this is the Mall, which leads from Buckingham Palace to Trafalgar Square, for anybody who knows London well. But what you see is the behaviour of the, let's say it's 1 million people. It went as far as you could see in terms of crowd. You see the little girl climbing the lamppost. You see people heading in all directions, apparently uncontrolled. And if you look at the left of the picture, you can see a line of yellow T-shirted, they were called bénévoles, French for volunteer, and the red coats of the performers. And that was all that was required to keep the audience safe and away from the performance. So that bubble of volunteers, 50 people, was created around wherever the elephant and the little girl moved, and they moved with it, keeping the audience at a distance. I'm showing you this slide because I think one of the things that we're going to have to talk about in the post-coronavirus landscape is ways that crowds can be managed, large crowds. Now this, you couldn't do this today, not today. You probably couldn't do it next year. But you can do things, and this is what I'm going to talk about throughout the day, where working outdoors rather than in the confines of a theatre, and using crowd management techniques which are bespoke for the event that you're producing, there are ways of managing and controlling a crowd. In 2008, we were invited on the back of having created the event for London to work in Liverpool as in European Capital of Culture. And La Machine, if I just take you back to that slide, François de la Rosière has a company called La Machine, which is different from Royal Deluxe. Royal Deluxe is a performing company. La Machine create the machines, literally as it sounds. So the elephant was built by and designed by François and his workshop. And in 2008, he was invited by the European Capital of Culture to produce the spider. It became known as La Princesse by the people of Liverpool. This was a huge mechanical spider that had 40 different planes of articulation. You can just see the manipulateur, the performers, sitting below the spider's head, controlling each of the limbs. It was technically, it was less emotionally connecting maybe than the elephant. Technically, it was a much harder and more complicated thing. So we commissioned this piece, the building of this spider, which anyone who saw the project will have seen it hanging off the side of a derelict building for days before the show started, and then climbing down the building. Incredibly brave in terms of the performers. And again, a scene that we won't be seeing for a long time yet, which is the huge crowds that massed in order to see the beautiful elephant. What you see in the top right corner of that photograph is a water tanker. This is one way of controlling crowds. It's sort of slightly reminiscent of riot police. We don't mean that in a bad way, but a few seconds after this photograph was taken, big water jets fired out of that water tanker, and the crowd just scattered. So there are funny and complicated ways of moving people along if you need to. And here, as the spider made its way through this crowd, people, I guess my point is that people in a way self-regulate. If you trust them enough, they will behave in a sensible enough way. So just to come back to me for a second, Artichoke, I suppose when you think of the kind of shows that we do, people think of those enormous crowds, the ones I've just shown you. And certainly in the early days, that was exactly how we made our living and created events. They were different from the kinds of things that most other people would attempt. They were enormously complicated, quite expensive, and involved an extraordinary degree of partnership, working with authorities who were more used to working with either government departments or big quasi-governmental organisations. And the idea that this funny little arts company would ship up and say, certainly in the terms of London, can we close the streets for 4 days, people would say, why would we do that? I never came up with a really great answer. The only answer in the end that I could think of that suited the purpose was, but why wouldn't you? And the why wouldn't you works very well when people understand what it is you're trying to do. So in the end, we took a whole load of people from the London authorities to France to see the company at work. And at that point, the why wouldn't you became very evident. So now, in these really difficult times, I think we face a very big why wouldn't you? Because I think that over the last 4 months or so, people certainly here, I was just talking to Connor about what it's been like in the Northwest for you, and that sort of slight sense of phony war, I guess, where the situation hasn't been so attritional and hasn't seemed so acute. But here, I live in the East End of London, and about 2 streets away from the Royal London Hospital, and certainly at the beginning, the only sounds you heard were the sound of sirens and the sound of the air ambulance coming in and out of the hospital. And it was really a strange time, reminiscent of, Camus' The Plague, or it felt really odd. The roads were quiet, the place was dead, nobody moving around, rats in the streets, which was a thing I haven't seen, just running openly. So it was a very strange time. And yet, although people were all hunkered down at home, I think increasingly there's been a sense that the rush or the transition to digital and online isn't enough. God, never sneezed in a presentation before, apologies. That the rush to online, to me, is doing 2 things, one of which is demonstrating that organisations are alive and well and they can be ultimately flexible in what they do, showing that they exist, also providing access to art and entertainment for the widest possible audience. And the huge advantage of digital, of course, is its accessibility, the fact that everybody all over the world can see everything. But for me, increasingly, there's been a real problem in terms of the oversupply, the impossibility of choosing all the many things that you think are on. The fact that, most importantly for me, the fact that it's ultimately, I feel, not engaging in the way that a live event is. There's no commitment to be there. I can get up in the middle of watching David Tennant and I can go and make a cup of tea and come back. I can pause it. I can not pause it. I can miss a bit. It doesn't feel like it's an event. And this talk, the future of events, I think needs to really examine what an event is, how it works emotionally, because in the end, all the stuff that Artichoke is engaged with is about engaging hearts, minds too, but mostly hearts. So there's that need for people to make a commitment to be somewhere. And I am a huge advocate of live. I've been a bit of a Luddite all my life about technology. I'm really happy to use technologies wherever we can to enhance the live experience or to make it available to people who really can't be there. But both of those events that I've just shown you would have been nothing if the public hadn't turned up. And certainly in 2006, when my partner Nikki and I had worked for this long 7-year period to bring the elephant to London, we stood in the Mall the night before it started on the Wednesday, and there was taxis passing and, general public cycling by or whatever. And we just stood there looking at each other saying, do you think anyone will come? Because this 7-year odyssey, the spending of what then seemed to be an enormous amount of money, the testing of whether Britain or the UK or London in particular was ready for this extraordinary event, or would be indifferent because, there is a complacency about having seen everything. And we stood in the street thinking, maybe it'll just be us. And the first day the show began was with the rocket, the little girl's rocket, crash landing into the ground, which was a staged moment we did overnight, so that when people woke up, suddenly there was this thing. And people were mildly interested. The Today programme broadcast as if this was a live story, as if a rocket really had crashed, which we sort of encouraged them to play along with us. But the next day, when the little girl emerged from the rocket and word of mouth and remember, no social media in 2006. So really nothing. People texting each other the odd photo and going, you should see this. But when the little girl got out of the rocket and walked to meet the elephant, we estimated that there were probably 40 or 50,000 people there on that first day. And we then knew that we were delighted that people had come, but we knew that we'd have a problem in terms of how many people would come over the next few days. And certainly that last slide I showed you, when the BBC said there were 1 million people on the streets, that was more than we'd ever anticipated. And hats off to that crowd who didn't need managing in the way that we're all encouraged to manage crowds. So, having talked about the rush to online, I suppose what I want to think about is how we create a world of live events in a post-coronavirus world where some people are very anxious about being in public, some people are desperate to be out there doing something new, and how we create a world and what kind of artworks we might create that allow people to come back out together. So I'm just going to show you a couple more pictures. Let me just do this. Because while, as I say, we're known for our big scale stuff, I also wanted to show you something that may be familiar to some of you up there in the Northwest, which was the piece that we made with Deborah Warner, Fiona Shaw and Mel Mercier, the Irish musician based in Dublin, which was Peace Camp. And many of you will remember or might have seen the images or may even have been to Mussenden Temple and the beach below, where we made an installation which was one of 9 installations created around the countries of Ireland, Scotland, Wales and England. 9 separate installations in different places, each of which had this beautiful re-orchestrated soundscape of poetry from the last 500 years in the languages of our countries, so Gaelic, Gaelic, Welsh, Cornish, English. And as you wandered through these tents alone through the night from dusk till dawn, you would hear voices whispering the sounds from the individual tents. And you would, I hope, have marveled at the peace and tranquility and that sense of love poems across the centuries still speaking to us today. It was commissioned by the London 2012 Arts Festival around the Olympics, and at a time when the rest of the world was descending into our various cities, but primarily into London to compete, to win. Deborah's conception of a wonderful event that was simply not about winning anything, but about the gift of language that we have all been given, and that celebration of its expressions of love seemed to us to be a wonderful antithetical kind of work that could be seen by one person at a time, a few people in a few groups. So as you see here, it was a kind of perfectly socially distanced artwork, and long before anybody was thinking about that as a necessity, this was something that the work itself dictated. So I think there are ways in which the future, even if the midterm future, can be just as rich as those events which have the mass audiences. It just needs a different way of experiencing it. So across the 9 installations, the audiences over the 4 days still topped thousands, never as big as the elephant, obviously. Thousands of people came to see it, but spread out over time, over distance. Again, it was a very complicated logistical exercise and had to look for the public as if it was utterly seamless. The only thing that stopped us, nothing human, but the tempests that raged in that, I don't know if anyone remembers the July 2012 summer, blew away some of the installations that we had in the north of Scotland. We were on the Isle of Lewis, and I watched as the tents just scattered across the beaches, which we had to collect in. So the weather was our foe here, but there was no human anxiety about experiencing it. People would come at 3 o'clock in the morning and stay for 2 hours. They'd come at 6 in the evening, they'd stay for 20 minutes. People just used it in the way that they felt comfortable. And we were really pleased and interested to discover how across these islands, conditions and language and time is so different. So when we were setting up the event in Valtos, which was the place on the Isle of Lewis, we were talking to them about it running from dusk till dawn, and the guys there said, but it never gets dark here in July. You can read the newspaper sitting on the beach at midnight. Whereas down in the south, in Cuckmere Haven in Sussex, we absolutely knew that nightfall, nautical nightfall, was at 9:30 or something. So even in this tiny, relatively tiny space that we were working, sort of, I don't know, maybe 1,000 square miles, you were looking at different worlds, different languages being spoken, different customs, but all united in the desire to see this beautiful piece and to share in that celebration of language that I was describing. We've done other pieces which similarly cover huge areas but can be experienced by few people at a time. In 2007, the artist Paul St. George came into my office and said, I've been told to talk to you, I've got an idea. And I said, what's the idea? And he said, there's a tunnel through the earth and there are people looking down it and they're seeing China. And I looked at him and went, I think they're seeing America. And he went, are they? And he had a picture, a little render of like a tube that you might put under a drainage tube or something. And I went, oh no, I think it looks prettier than that. And he and I together, we evolved this idea of a sort of steampunk telectroscope, like a giant telescope that could see under the Atlantic. That actually he imagined that his long lost ancestor had once upon a time dug a tunnel starting in the middle of the Atlantic at Oak Island. You can see the elaborate nature of the storytelling. Had gone dug down in this island and then expanded across west and east until he arrived in America and in Britain. And all that was required for this piece was to uncork those tunnels and to reinvent the plan that he'd left for a giant viewing machine. It was called a device for the suppression of absence, one that I think we all need now, or perhaps we all have it in the form of Skype. Anyway, we built 2 of these huge telescopes. You can see the sort of steampunk vibe, and placed one here outside City Hall, right next to the Tower of London. The other one was in Brooklyn. We shipped it across the Atlantic. We did a deal with a company that we co-promoted with there. And we placed one in Brooklyn against the Brooklyn Bridge. So in each case, there was, as you stood and looked down the telectroscope, there was a view for the viewer in the other continent of you standing against an iconic bridge that immediately located where you were. And you can see that it's huge. It's quite small in terms of viewing capacity. What was amazing was to see people using it. It was soundless, so people had to use their imagination in terms of how they communicated and who they communicated with. That could be random people on the other side of the world, or increasingly, we had it up for 27 days. 28 days it would have required planning permission, so we left it at 27. People increasingly used it to meet friends and relatives. So a 1-year-old had her birthday party in London with her grandparents sharing the moment in New York, or a guy wanted to propose to his boyfriend in America and came with those Bob Dylan placards. I'm sure you've seen the original video, which basically said, will you marry me? And luckily the guy at the other end went. So this is socially distanced, beyond socially distanced. This is continental distancing. And on the final day when we were closing it down, a family of 28 people from Deptford in South London came to meet their extended family in Brooklyn. There was a huge temptation to say, you could do this at home. It's, you know, in your bed. It's actually called Skype. But what was so fantastic about it was exactly what we're talking about here, the sense of event, the idea that you had to turn up, you had to be present, you had to experience it for real. And the fiction was maintained in the design inside, those guys are looking down a tunnel, and it does look like they're looking down a tunnel that takes them to America. But obviously it was using contemporary digital technology, which at the time was difficult because there was the technological systems weren't as advanced as they are now. It'd be easier to do now. But it brought this extraordinary sense of joy and delight for people to play with something that allowed them to have these sort of real-time magical experiences. So, I'm going to talk in a minute about Lumiere, because many of you will have seen, as Gareth referred to, Lumiere in Derry, and you'll know that we run that programme in Durham in the north of England every 2 years, and have done for the last 10 years, but also programmed it in London. And I think that the issues are, we're proceeding with Lumiere 2021 as normal. One of the things that we had to do in Derry, but much more so in Durham, was work out how to control crowds in very, very tight spaces. So in Durham, when we invented Lumiere in 2009, again, Nikki and I stood in the cathedral wondering if anyone was going to come on day one. And by the end of day 4, 75,000 people had come, which was great in a town of 40,000 population. That meant that, in fact, managing that first one wasn't so difficult. Although it felt very crowded, there was a sort of jolly surprise going on. Year 2, 2 years later, the crowd doubled to 125,000, and that was really, really problematic for us. Durham is a city built on a rocky outcrop, designed, surrounded by water, designed to keep people out. And actually the idea of forcing 125,000 people through those streets, narrow cobbled streets, wet, leading up to the cathedral and the castle, when those streets are designed as a defence to make it difficult for people to move through the city, it became obvious that we needed to do things that would really control the crowds. And the first thing that we did in 2009 was, hold on, doing all these things simultaneously is almost more than I'm equipped to do. The first thing we did was to create a sense of place in Durham. The Lindisfarne Gospels, which were the work of a monk living on Lindisfarne Island, drawn over a period of 40 years, the first illustration of the Gospels in English, have for a long time been held in the British Library as one of their great treasures. There's a feeling in the northeast of England that they shouldn't be down in London, they should be coming back home. And so rather than engage with that argument, we thought we would just bring them back home. So persuaded the British Library to allow us to replicate the slides in high-res definition on Durham Cathedral, which is one of the most beautiful buildings in the country. And thousands and thousands of people wanted to get there. It was like a magnet, and it's at the heart of the city, up the hill, through all these windy lanes. And we had to invent a crowd management system that would allow us to regulate the numbers of people in the city centre at any one time. So our audiences have now grown to about 240,000 in this town of 40,000 people. Everything is the same. The population is the same. The streets are the same size. The narrowness of the streets is the same, but the audience just keeps growing. And so we've had to invent new ways of managing them, whether that's through restricting access to the city centre over certain times, issuing free but time slot tickets that allow people in so that we never have more people in the city centre than we can handle, spreading the programme across the city outside the peninsula, the bit that's enclosed by water, so that there's more to see outside than there is to see in the city centre. We spend probably 2/3 of our time on crowd management and logistics, and about 1/3 of our time actually curating and programming the festival. And we have to do what we do with the understanding and compliance of the artists, who sometimes find it funny, I think, to understand that their work is being, that the site that they've chosen for their work involves us thinking about it as to whether it's an impediment to crowd flow, whether it's part of a pattern which encourages people to move from one place to another because it's sitting along a route that is taking people back into town. So the logistics around which we plan, I think in Durham, and we did it as well in Derry, as I'm sure Gareth will remember, those kind of techniques and that way of thinking is going to become increasingly important as we open up to live events. But we have to be responsible in terms of the numbers of people that we're allowing in and the numbers of people who are in any one place at any one time. So we, of necessity in Durham, and also when we came to you in Derry, had to really think about movement of people, volumes, numbers. And anybody who was around in Lumiere 2013 in Derry will remember the issues that we had on the Peace Bridge, where during the course of the evening it became clear that although the bridge had been built for numbers of people going across, we were testing it to its limits and had to in the end close it and pulse people across in 50s and 100s rather than allowing that free flow of people. I have to say, State Services, who we were working with in Derry at the time, were the most magnificent stewarding company I've ever worked with. And the way they handled that incident and crowd was really exemplary. It's those kind of things, that marriage between event producers and their crowd management planners and stewards and all of that kind of stuff, that is going to become increasingly important. That everyone, I think, is going to have to take those things very seriously. This was a lovely installation that we did by a company called Lumiere di Cagna from Italy in the central marketplace in Durham. And again, it was part of a crowd management moment where people heading up to the cathedral would find something else to entertain them, which allowed us to slightly regulate the crowds in the city centre. So I think that for me, the future of events is going to be very much around what we can do, what provision we can put in place still to encourage people to come out, because I really genuinely believe that our lives can't be regulated in terms of all of us sitting at home watching screens, watching the telly, watching our computers, looking at our phones. Those devices are really extraordinary and useful in terms of feeling connected to a wider world. So, on your phone, you can have as many friends as you want, thousands of friends. You can go anywhere, you can feel anything. But you can't feel real emotion. You can't smell things. You can't understand what it feels to be right next to an engine that's pulsing as it drives a giant mechanical elephant through its streets. And I think that, or, to listen to live music, the thrill of it, and the fact that it is a congregation of people engaged in the same thing at the same moment, are things that we miss. And the power of congregation is very strong, I think, from the early days of religious worship through to what we do now when we go to festivals and all that kind of stuff. So I suppose for me, the future of events is going to be around outdoors, essentially, and people talk endlessly about the problems of weather. But again, if you work with inventive artists, a lot of our work is done in the wet and cold in the winter. Peace Camp was great for us. It was the first time we'd ever worked in the summer. We all thought it was going to be brilliant and we'll all be full of suntan. In fact, it rained almost the whole month. And was really blowy, as I've described. But weather is just a question of planning, but also a question of the inventiveness of the artists that you work with, addressing the conditions they're likely to encounter and making work that's robust enough to withstand those kind of pressures. And then questions around understanding audience desire, movement, ways in which you can help them to experience the work, whether that's by making something like a Peace Camp that lasts for 12 hours and they can visit it at any time, or whether that's, if you are going to do a time limited thing, controlling the numbers and allowing people to experience it, not in huge crowds, but in distance crowds in a way that they feel safe. So I think that my view is that there is a future in live events. My own company, normally we work on 1 or 2 things a year and we have something else in development. We've currently got 15 projects underway, which will or won't take place in the back end of this year and going forward. And they're all things that are invented in a way that allows them to take place whatever the government constraints are. So things that will be visible up on high, that you don't have to make an appointment to see, things that last long times, all of that stuff is part of the way that we're planning. And I was saying earlier to Connor that for Artichoke, we've never waited for anybody to invite us to do anything. We've always, sometimes we'll take a commission. Certainly Lumiere Derry was an invitation from the City of Culture programme to do the closing event. But most often we're just talking to artists and thinking, oh, this is something that we could make happen, let's make that happen. So the test for us, we don't rely on people commissioning us, and we don't very often charge for what we do. So we haven't suffered a loss of income because we never have an income. We don't rent rooms, we don't sell merchandise, we don't run a bar. So none of the things that are hurting more conventional venues, one of those sirens I just described, they're not hurting us at the moment. We're not in a different position from how we were 6 months ago. I think what will be the test for us is whether the sources of funding that we would normally go to for our quite large scale events, whether those dry up, and we don't know the answer to that at the moment. We're currently investigating what the funding situation looks like for next year and the year after. So it may be that we have to withdraw a bit, or I doubt that we downsize because it's difficult to do things for us. There's an anticipation in terms of audiences that if there's an Artichoke event, it will be large scale and everyone will want to come. So doing things on a more intimate level is harder unless we design them as I've described, so that that's how they're meant to be experienced. So the future for organisations like ourselves is to keep working with artists who can invent their way around these difficulties that we're currently in, and to keep pressure on public authorities, in my case Arts Council England and the cities, to understand the importance of what we do in terms of bringing people together, combating that sense of isolation, the sense of despair, the sense of anxiety, by creating opportunities for people to come together. There you go, Gareth. Do you want to ask me some questions?
Okay, Helen. Some questions coming in, and again, folks, if you have any questions, just pop them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. So we have a couple here to start, Helen. So from Jim Collins, local heartthrob in Derry. How do you convince local authorities, funders, of the importance of engaging hearts when decision makers often see economic drivers as the priority?
This is a really interesting question. I would cite for you Durham County Council, with whom we work as partners and have done for over 10 years. I think Terry Collins, the chief executive of the council, would say that Artichoke, working with the council, has changed the culture of the county. It's a very impoverished, I think it's maybe the 4th or 5th poorest county in England. It has very high levels of unemployment and rising, which before coronavirus was an unusual thing here. It has very high levels of literacy. educational attainment is quite low. All the things that a deindustrialized place that has, in its case, lost coal mining, shipbuilding, and steel working would experience. So in 1979, a period just around the miners' strike, there were 167,000 miners in County Durham, and today there are none. There are villages where there's third generation unemployment. And what is really amazing about that county and the county council is that they've decided that culture is one of the tools that they have to rebuild the place, to rebuild confidence, to rebuild the economy. So they fund Durham Lumiere to the tune of, I can't remember, about £800,000, which is an astonishing investment, if you like. They've measured the return on their investment at over 4,000%. So during the weekend itself, when we're there, the return to the wider community is about £10.5 million. That's everything from hotels and restaurants and car parking and, you know, all the things that you can measure, we try and measure. The advertising value equivalent, which is the measure of public profile they get through press and media, is counted in millions. And why that matters is not so much the value of it, but the fact that it's created a profile for Durham, which goes internationally, which says this is a place that's confident, that's able to do these things, that creates pride in its local people. We do an impact survey with the council every year, which is commissioned by them from independent evaluators, so we're not evaluating ourselves. And they come back with astonishing statistics, like 96% of people surveyed say, this made me happy, this is good for our town, this makes me proud, all of those kind of things alongside all the economic metrics. So they have, I guess, through a 10-year investment, seen that the financial returns are important, but equally important is the sense of well-being, sense of community, sense of pride. Lumiere, elements of Lumiere are now taught in the curriculum in primary and senior schools. We work across the county throughout the 2-year gap between the two festivals. And that council has really embraced art and culture as one of its economic drivers. I had a text from Terry the other day saying, no plans to change anything as far as we're concerned. Culture is going to drive people back to the city. And certainly for those of you who remember Lumiere Derry, you'll remember the shops staying open late, the cafes brimful, you know, up until 11 o'clock at night, people out on the streets, people moving between territories that they might normally not have visited after dark. It did have an incredible impact, and that wasn't just about the money, but the money was important, but it was also about people having a sense of freedom. I remember one of my own board members crossing the Peace Bridge behind a family, grandmother, mother and 2 daughters, and he heard the grandmother say, I'm just so glad that your childhood is so different from mine. And you think that those kind of things, there aren't really metrics to measure those kind of things, but once you know they're true, then the role that art and culture has to play in the life of a place, it becomes validated in extraordinary ways.
Definitely. Next one here from Paul Brown, who's the director of Artichoke Arts Festival. Paul says, hello everyone and welcome to Donegal, Derry. Thank you to Helen and all at Derry City Instrumentalist Council for presenting this webinar. We find this a very pertinent subject at Artichoke Arts Festival, which is currently in the middle of a live pop-up theatre tour across villages in Donegal. Whilst the considerations, guidelines and costs of doing so are significantly amplified, the energy and appreciation from audiences reinforces the ever-existing appetite and need for live rather than online events. So a question for Helen. Peer support via informal and formal networks and associations continues to provide invaluable advice and support to the process of repurposing festivals and events via shared learning experiences. Aside from the national agencies and forums, what other networks or resources are evolving that would benefit promoters in informing their plans for future events?
One of the networks I'm not sure that you make use of, I don't know exactly what's around, but My great friend Angus McKechnie runs a thing called Outdoor Arts UK, which you can find under that title. And they have been advising the Westminster government on issues around outdoor live performance. I think the government's view is outdoor performance is somehow, Glyndebourne performing in their gardens, or the Minack Theatre in Cornwall doing Shakespeare with the backdrop of the sea, not understanding the huge variety of possibilities that exist in terms of outdoor presentation. But Angus, I think they're producing a guide to outdoor performance, and certainly Bradley Hemmings, who's the director of the Greenwich and Docklands Festival, which is happening live in London pretty much as it normally would, but with enormous amounts of provision around health and safety and coronavirus constraints. He is very interesting in terms of what they've had to put in place. It's in August, so it's in a minute. And they usually get audiences in hundreds, if not thousands. So I think that the question around those I think there's a whole network of festivals and others who work across boundaries, who will be looking at ways in which things can be both produced live and maybe streamed online for a broader audience. And I know that some theatres are thinking about doing shows where they do both, which they have a live audience, but there's also a live stream for those who can't be there. It's hard because the regulations are changing all the time. I don't know if any of you saw Andrew Lloyd Webber on the news a couple of days ago pleading with the government to lift the social distancing requirements in theatres, saying that theatres could manage people through safely by using, they've imported a kind of, looked like a sort of airport mag and bag device that screened people as they went through, and they were sort of sprayed with disinfectant or something. It was all very high tech, but he was saying it's not possible to function as we used to with these 25% audiences, not only because of the money, but also because of the experience that nobody likes being in a theatre that's half empty. We didn't before, we don't now. So I think there's a lot of pressure and a lot of advice available through organisations like Outdoor Arts UK in terms of how things are moving forward.
Another one here, Helen, from Jacqueline Worski at Derry-Londonderry Council. She's asked, are you aware or involved in any of the pilot programmes that the British government are talking about rolling out with regard to kickstarting testing events?
So what I was talking yesterday to one of the directors of the Arts Council here in England. What's clear is that the 1.57 billion that the government are promised, and I think there's more promised for the devolved administrations under the whatever it's called, the Barnett formula or whatever. What's clear about that here, not that there's much clarity, is that it's recovery money. It's a government programme, so it's not an enhancement of Arts Council England's funding to spend as they see fit, but it's recovery money that is going to be given to organisations that won't survive through to April unless they get an injection of cash. So there's no money there, as far as I understand it, for any new work or anything to be evolved that might point to a different kind of future. It's money that's going to be pumped into existing organisations and institutions in order to keep their doors closed, but the organisations ticking over. I think that the conversation I was having was whether that included outdoor activity. It's really not clear. What is clear, though, is that there seems to be a requirement by the Treasury to spend it all by September. So it'll be the fastest spending of £1.5 billion on the arts that anyone's ever seen. And it's not clear to me why it has to be spent by September. But I think they need it out the door before maybe before the autumn spending review or something. So it isn't clear that outdoor is included in that bailout, because I think that government view is that arts councils across our countries have always privileged buildings and institutions over events and outdoor activity. And I think that there's a general feeling that if a building closes, that's a tragedy, whereas if an outdoor event doesn't happen, nobody really minds. But it's not clear to me that any of that support money is going to be really directed at the outdoors, although that's what I was lobbying for yesterday.
Well, there's a question maybe ties in with that there. So only a second. We have a number of cultural organisations here in the Northwest who traverse venue-based and outdoor programming, or that's festival focused and other. Is this the future for all venue-based organisations, do you think?
What's interesting about exclusively venue-based organisations is that they've almost seemed to be the most paralysed by this. They, you know, apart from the move to online, there's been no real examination, it seems to me, of what outdoors might offer. And I think that the desire simply to replicate what goes on outdoors is not necessarily ever going to be satisfactory. I think spoken word stuff, if you're thinking about theatres, it's really hard to do outdoors well, and it is really affected by questions of weather and all of that sort of stuff. And it isn't just about whacking up a stage and, you know, letting people perform. The conditions for outdoors really do need some thinking about. And I think there's an organisation, I was looking at it this morning, I can't remember what it's called, but I'll make sure that these webinar organisers have the mail, which is a voluntary advice session from technical organisations, so staging, rigging, lighting and other companies have come together to provide advice for organisations wanting to move outdoors so that they can give them best practice advice in terms of how to handle all of that stuff. I'll look it up in a minute and make sure that you have those connections. But yeah, I think that if indoor venues can find a way to do work outside with a sense of authenticity, with a sense that it's not second best and everyone's just desperately waiting till you can go back indoors again. I think that one of the things I've always wondered about was when places like the National Theatre in London has an outdoor events programme, it's never given the same levels of attention, funding, you know, profile as the stuff that goes on the indoor stages. It's seen to be an entertainment rather, you know, to keep the crowds happy, rather than an area of work that should be seriously invested in. And I obviously think that the reverse is true, and that more magical and marvellous things can happen outdoors as well as in theatres.
So a question from Trelock from Donegal County Council here, and it says, while social distancing is a critical factor, do you see a greater role or change of direction for companies such as your own in devising and producing smaller scale public events in less densely populated rural locations? And how might you approach the creation of the necessary new partnerships with local authorities and communities that may not have worked with a company like Artichoke before?
I hope so is the answer, because I think that we and other companies who have long been plugging away at this field, literally of live and outdoor, do have real expertise in terms of how to mobilise communities and to create those kind of partnerships. All our work is about partnerships with either willing or reluctant participants who, when we start on a journey on one of our big projects, very often are saying, as I said at the beginning, why would we do this? This is just too hard. Certainly in Derry, I think Gareth can attest to the fact that it was complicated getting Lumiere off the ground. Just even things like, I don't know, the regulation around road closures, which we knew was essential to people really enjoying the place. But obviously in the particular situation in the city, closing a road and announcing that you were closing a road in advance was an impossibility. So we had to work really carefully with people to take note of local sensibilities, and yet to try and create the situation that worked for the event. So in terms of partnerships, you know, we will work with anybody where there's an invitation, but the only thing I would say is that the only way I know how to work is that there's always an artist at the centre of everything that we do, or artists. So I believe that, and it's not fashionable at the moment, but I do believe that artists are strange and wonderful people who have a view of the world that is unlike anybody else. And that if you can get them to engage with a challenge or a problem or a way of working, then the ideas that they come back to you with are beyond anything that you or I or our audiences could imagine. And the point of working with an artist is to take the public to a place that they've never imagined being before. And so I guess the question is, you know, what do you want to do and who are you doing it for and who are you doing it with? And my advice would always be that to realize the imagination of an artist somehow takes you to a place where audiences, the public, stakeholders, everybody are more satisfied than if you just do an event. It's a bit like the difference between working with an artist in order to tap into that very vivid imagination or thinking, oh, you know, put up a wall chart on this day, we'll do, you know, a reading in a library on this day, we'll do this, on this day, we'll do this. If you ask an artist to look at an overall shape of a program or a challenge, then you'll get a much better and more imaginative and more extraordinary result than if you think that it's simply a sort of programming job. So when we did Temple, for instance, in your lovely city in Derry, the artist I wanted to be at the heart of it was the mercurial and extraordinary David Best. So I had the idea of turning the bonfire burning tradition upside down and on its head and imbuing the idea of bonfires with a different set of values. That was my contribution. But the actual realization of that, the making of it, the emotional engagement, all of that sort of stuff came from David. So I had to track him down in California and say, will you come? Could you do this? I'm not sure that David ever, would you say, Gareth, particularly grasped the political and social nuance of the city, but
I don't think he wanted to. I think he was a man on a mission himself, and I suppose we both learned as the process went on that he pulled out different things and reached things that if we, as you say, like programming, if we put a flip chart what we want to achieve, we would have thought it was going to achieve something else that would have made people from both sides of the divide stop burning flags in their bonfires. That's what I would have thought initially, but it drew out that it was about people letting go and
it's about pain and grief and
suicide and
post-traumatic stress. And, you know, there was a macro from our side, both Gareth and I and all the people involved, there was a kind of, this is a cross-community moment. But for David, it was about the personal. It was about the reconciliation of people, not with each other, but with themselves and with their own pain and grief. And that, you know, anybody could see, if you were me or anyone involved in producing it, that there was a bigger picture that was picked up by the press and all of that stuff. But what David achieved in terms of those people who took part and those people who visited was something that nobody could have imagined, don't you think, Gareth?
Definitely no. If only all projects were like that. I never experienced anything like it. I said, wouldn't call it post-traumatic stress, but I definitely experienced something that stayed with me for weeks, months after. Like just because you were there, you were witnessing what was going on. It was definitely something else.
So that's the argument about whatever you do, or whatever scale, rural, tiny villages, big city events, national, international events, artists are always the key. They just, however annoying they are, and they can be, can they not, Gareth? They're just amazing people, have amazing capacity to change the world.
Definitely. So another one here, Helen, from David T. Van. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's the festival advisor of the Arts Council of Ireland. And he's very sorry that he can't be in Donegal in person to experience Little John Lee's travelling theatre.
Yeah.
And firstly, terrific presentation from yourself, Helen, and wonderful to hear that your organisation is working on many projects heading into 2021. And more a comment than a question, but he's following up from Paul Brown's question, and he would suggest that in addition to peer networks, which he agrees that are crucial to finding our way forward in this time of crisis, there is a need for cross-sectoral discourse that brings local authority officials, health and safety professionals, arts professionals and governmental representatives together. And he's wondering, maybe you'd like to make a comment on this.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's true anyway, so when we worked with you, when we work in Durham, we work in London. London, particularly as a world city, was very complicated, and we had probably 30 different agencies working with us to make Lumiere London happen. Also, the Great Fire Project that we did, where we burnt a replica of 17th century London in the middle of the Thames. You can't imagine how complicated getting the permissions to do that were. But it's always a partnership. So we have these things, we have steering and operational planning groups. We work across agencies. In a sense, those agencies, certainly over here, meet all the time anyway, but they meet for things that they sort of think are important, like, you know, visit of President Trump, or the very rare occasion England win a test match or something, and they have to shut the streets and do all of that kind of stuff. When you rock up and you're doing an arts project, sometimes it's hard for them to take you seriously because they don't understand the impact. But case in point, the elephant, we work with the 25 guys who form what's called the LOSPG, the Licensing Operation Safety Planning Group, and that is everybody that you're describing. So that's the blue light services, fire, police, ambulance, it's the London Underground, it's the bus service, it's Westminster City Council, it's the Greater London Authority, it's the Diplomatic Protection Squad, it's the bomb squad, it's the Metropolitan Police, it's all of those people, Health and Safety Executive, ourselves, our production companies, meeting together, usually monthly, to plan out the detail of what we're doing. And in London for the elephant, I was very naive and new to the whole thing and just fought my way through 7 years of people saying no until we did it. One of the most moving moments for me was each night after we finished, we did what was called a hot debrief, where all of those people, representatives, all of those agencies met together to talk about what had gone well, what had gone badly, what was coming up the next day, what we needed to prepare for. When it was finished on the Sunday and I was surrounded by friends and family going, wow, that was amazing, they kept calling me for the debrief on the Sunday afternoon, and I was thinking, Jesus, haven't we finished? There's nothing to say, you know, why? So I had to leave my friends and go across to this group who was standing on Horse Guards Parade waiting, 25 guys in a circle. And I got there, and Tim Owen, who was the chair of the group working for Westminster City Council, said all he'd wanted. He just stood there and he said, okay, now we're all here. Has anyone got anything to say apart from that was the best thing any of us have ever worked on? It was just such an incredible moment because they'd done the marathons, they'd done the, you know, royal weddings, they'd done London 2012. They hadn't done 2012 at that point, but they'd done, you know, Commonwealth Games, they'd done all these things that involved closing the roads for political demos, for, you know, the countryside march, all that kind of stuff. And for those hard-bitten veterans who'd been so hard to persuade to stand there and say this was the best thing, was incredibly moving. And I think that in building those partnerships, you also build a sense of significance of events like this. So if in this time, when it's really difficult, you can start to put those coalitions together so that people are working together for a purpose in order to create one of these important moments, then I think that that would be time well spent.
Just a couple more, Helen. Just regarding those with health and disability issues, how does Artichoke approach providing for people vulnerable or at risk with disabilities to attend your events, and how do you see this maybe being enhanced in the future?
We work with people like Access All Areas, Shape, other specialist providers who do give us advice, both generic advice but also specific advice on individual events that we're doing. Sometimes we create quiet zones, we create special access routes. We sometimes, in Durham for instance, where it is, as I've said, very busy and very crowded Thursday to Sunday, and I'm telling you this because it's obviously a secret, none of you will tell anybody, we're installing for 10 days before we open on the Thursday, and that means that on the Wednesday night we usually use it as a dress rehearsal and we test everything. But nobody seems to have worked that out yet. So we're testing everything in the public realm. There's never anyone about because it's not advertised as one of the festival nights. So what we've tended to do with the Wednesday night, with the dress rehearsal, is to use that to invite people with disabilities, with any kind of access issues, any kind of vulnerabilities. So people who are, you know, maybe neurodiverse and don't welcome big crowds, large noises, big noises, all of that kind of stuff. So we use the dress rehearsal night to invite special groups to come in, and we steward them through the installations so that they can experience it in a much quieter context. Obviously, we do a lot of stuff online, so if people really don't want to be there live, then they can pick up what we're doing through their computers or whatever devices that they use. But we do take those issues very seriously. We're also working on commissioning disabled artists to make work in that context, and very often that speaks to whatever disability they are experiencing, and using that as a platform to help people communicate to a broader audience about what it is like to be a person who has those sort of vulnerabilities or challenges.
Well, Helen, you now have experience of working north and south of this island.
I'm honoured.
Is there similarities? Is there room for improvement north and south to enable us maybe not just with yourselves but with companies off your like to produce large scale events? Is there anything we can do going forward, or anything you see that would make things easier? Or?
There's lots of things that could be different. I think so many of you will know that for a brief moment I was creative director of Galway 2020 from January 19 to March 20. It was a real education for me, I have to say. It was a different, I mean, it's obviously a different country in terms of regulation, in terms of practice, in terms of ways in which it works, in terms of the numbers of people you have to talk to get permission to do anything. So I think it was unfortunate that I couldn't have been there a bit earlier, because a lot of what we do when I talk about that coalition building takes a long time. And the difference for me working in Galway was that here in England anyway, I get it. I know, even if people aren't saying what they're saying, I know what they're saying. I feel I understand the song beneath the words, if you like. And in Galway, I was very definitely a stranger, and didn't have time to build as much as I would have liked those friendships and relationships and coalition partners. I think also that the Artichoke way of doing things is, and also what we do, I suppose I hadn't realised that it was unusual. I mean, I know it's unusual, but for us it's so normal, and maybe I was a bit stupid about that. So if you look at the Galway programme, it's absolutely peppered with, sorry, everybody wants to talk to me. It's absolutely peppered with Artichoke style events, one of which you may have had the opportunity to see either online or live, which was the first and last event that we did, which was the Carricola amazing illumination of the mountains at Loch na Fui. Getting permission to do that was a real struggle in advance, and getting permission to do it on the day was impossible, because it was the day that Leo Varadkar declared a sort of lockdown. What we did was we got permission, sort of, to run it as a documentation thing, a rehearsal, if you like, a test, which we had been running all week, but never right through the night, which is what we ended up doing on that fateful Thursday or Friday, or whatever it was. We knew that technically we shouldn't be doing it, but we needed to document this enormous process that had gone on. But we also needed a an opportunity for anybody who could decide to make it out there to get there. So I think we had 6,000 people who took to their cars, not invited by us, definitely not invited by us, but they just happened to be driving the road at that time in the middle of nowhere when this wonderful light work was happening. But I suppose what I'd hoped about the whole year was that by starting with that brilliant programme launch that we did with Graziel in the main city square in September, and then the opening ceremony, which got blown away by storm and tempest, and then that Caricola piece, that we would have set the tone for the year, that would have made it easier for the authorities to understand what it was we were talking about when we said we're creating an installation that covers this hillside and people will experience it from dusk till dawn, whatever. There didn't seem to be a common grammar or understanding in terms of what we were actually trying to do. And I think that after we'd done a few of them, it would have got much easier. But it was hard. It was hard to get through the permissions that allowed things to happen. And I hadn't realised how amazingly regulated the wilderness of the Irish countryside is. So it seemed like every possible place we wanted to do something outdoors was covered by some site of special scientific interest, or some conservation, or there were peregrine falcons, or there were archaeological remains, or there was something that meant, and there seemed to be no way round any of that regulation. Whereas I'm really used to working in difficult circumstances, but finding a collaborative way of solving a problem so that we could make something happen, rather than not making something happen, which is never as satisfactory.
I suppose on that, Helen, you've mentioned that Artichoke are working on 13 events for 2021, 2022. Is there any events planned?
Refurbishing our own office, which we thought we'd do while nobody was in there. That's one of them.
Yeah. But is there any events planned for Derry or Donegal? And if not,
why not?
If not, why not? When do we start the conversation?
Waiting for the invitation, Gareth. Derry, Donegal, Derry particularly, is a place so close to our hearts. You know, from Peace Camp, when we knew nobody, but it was one of the beautiful sites that Deborah Warner selected for that amazing 9 installation piece, through to Temple, and, you know, via Lumiere. Artichoke as a company really love working in your city and in that countryside, and there's so much to do and so much to say. It's just, we've just got these 13 other things to get through.
Yeah, just keep in touch then. And all I can say is, you know, thanks a million for taking time out and taking part in this event. It's been great to chat to you. I hope everybody that's tuned in has enjoyed it as much as I've had. This event was part of the Arts Festival, which continues in the days ahead. If anybody wants to check out what's on, log on to www.eaf.ie. Again, Helen, thanks again.
Pleasure.
Look forward to seeing you on Irish shores in the near future. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.